So if you're listening to this right now, I want you to just imagine fighting for your freedom for like generations.
Right, going through all of that struggle.
Yeah, escaping the most brutal, systematic slavery in the ancient world. You're wandering the wilderness and you finally build a society that is unlike anything else on Earth.
Amen.
And then after all that, you voluntarily vote to put yourselves right back in chains.
It is, it's a staggering irony.
It really is. And that's exactly what we are deep diving into today. We are traveling back to the year 1043 BC.
To a town called Ramah.
Exactly, because this is a massive watershed moment in history. It's the exact moment an entire nation, the nation of Israel, demanded a radical change to their entire system of government.
They had this totally unique, decentralized identity.
Right, and they traded it all in for a deeply flawed political machine.
Which is wild.
It is. And, if you've ever felt a deep, almost hardwired frustration with modern leadership like greedy politicians, corrupt local officials,
Systems that just seem designed to exalt the people in power at the expense of everyday citizens.
yes. If you've felt that, you're going to see exactly where that playbook was written. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's just a stunning moment of transition to examine.
It really is. So to really grasp the gravity of 1043 BC, we have to look at the massive sociological shift that had just happened for the Israelites.
Right, because they started out as nomadic wanderers.
Moving from place to place.
Exactly. For decades, they had absolutely no geographic anchor. But eventually, they crossed into the Promised Land, and they began to settle.
And settling down fundamentally changes the psychology of a people, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. I mean, you go from surviving day to day to, well, building infrastructure, planting multi-generational crops.
Establishing trade routes.
Yeah, all of that. But their governance structure during this period was, it was entirely unique in the ancient Near East.
Right, because they had no centralized government.
None at all. There was no capital city, no parliament.
No standing army.
Right. And absolutely no monarch. Instead, they were guided by these figures known historically as judges.
And I feel like we need to pause here because when we use the word judge today, it brings up a very specific image.
Yeah, someone in a black robe.
Sitting behind an elevated wooden bench, banging a gavel, presiding over a courtroom.
Right, right.
But that is fundamentally not what these historical figures were doing in ancient Israel. That translation hurdle creates a lot of confusion.
It really does.
Yeah.
A much better way to think of these biblical judges is as localized military chieftains or deliverers.
Delivered, okay.
Yeah, because the era of the judges was marked by this brutal, repetitive cycle. The people of Israel would abandon their covenant commitments.
Their society would morally fracture.
Exactly. And without a unified defense, foreign enemies like the Philistines or the Midianites would invade and just violently oppress them.
And in the midst of that severe distress, the people would cry out.
And in response to that cry, God would raise up one of these judges.
Just kind of out of nowhere, right?
Basically, yeah. This person would emerge to militarily deliver the people, break the oppression, and restore temporary order.
So it was a purely reactionary system.
Entirely. They didn't maintain a standing defense force at all.
They just relied completely on God raising up a specific flawed human being for a specific immediate crisis.
Right. Which brings us to the central figure of this whole narrative, Samuel.
Samuel. He is such a fascinating, deeply transitional character.
He really is. He serves as the very last of these judges.
But he also operates as a prophet.
Right. He wears many hats. He unifies the tribes and provides leadership that almost borders on a kingship, honestly.
But without the title.
Yeah.
Or the oppressive apparatus of a king.
Exactly. And for decades, he wears those hats incredibly well. He is this bedrock of stability for the entire nation.
But, there is an undeniable biological reality setting in here.
He's aging.
Samuel is aging. He is nearing the end of his life. And in any organization, whether it's a modern corporation or an ancient tribal confederacy, whenever a strong, charismatic, singular leader begins to age out of their role,
It creates a massive vacuum.
a huge succession crisis begins to loom. Everyone is looking around asking, well, who holds this together when the great deliverer is gone?
Which is the ultimate organizational nightmare.
Right. You have a founder-level figure and absolutely no clear plan for what happens on day 2 without them.
And this broad national anxiety gets triggered by a very specific, localized failure of leadership.
Because Samuel tries to solve this massive succession crisis himself.
He does. He takes his 2 sons, Joel and Abijah, and he appoints them to serve as judges in his place.
He stations them down in Beersheba, which is a town in the extreme southern territory of Israel.
And that localized decision is exactly where the entire national structure begins to unravel.
Hey, hold on. Let's unpack this, though. Because Samuel was a prophet, he literally spoke for the divine. How does a man with that level of spiritual insight commit such a basic, blinding act of nepotism? I mean, up until this point, judges were raised up by God in response to an immediate crisis, right?
Yes, it was always a divine calling.
It was never a hereditary title. You don't just inherit the role of a military deliverer because your dad was really good at it.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
And that is exactly the friction point here. Samuel's decision was highly dubious.
It completely broke historical precedent.
It did. Historically, God took the initiative to call these leaders. By unilaterally appointing his sons, Samuel is attempting to manufacture continuity.
He is looking at a spiritual reality, the need for God to raise up a leader, and trying to force a structural, institutional solution onto it.
He's trying to institutionalize a miracle.
Wow. Yeah, he wants the security of knowing the system will keep running, rather than trusting the unpredictable nature of divine deliverance.
Exactly. And beyond that, there is a tragic, almost blinding irony to Samuel's actions here.
Oh, the Eli connection.
Yes. Decades earlier, when Samuel was just a boy, he was trained by a high priest named Eli.
And Eli's entire legacy was utterly destroyed.
His family was cursed precisely because Eli's own sons abused their inherited positions of leadership. They completely corrupted the priesthood.
So Samuel grew up watching firsthand how devastating and destructive inherited corrupt leadership could be.
Right. He watched his mentor lose everything because of it.
And yet, at the end of his own life, Samuel walks right into the exact same trap with Joel and Abijah.
It's a terrifying blind spot, isn't it?
It really is. It shows that even the most insightful leaders can be completely blinded by their own legacy and, frankly, their own children.
Oh, definitely. And we should point out these two sons weren't just slightly less competent than their father.
No, they were systemically, ruthlessly corrupt.
The historical record lays out a very specific four-part indictment against Joel and Abijah.
This wasn't just administrative inefficiency, they were actively predatory.
Right. So the first indictment is foundational. They completely abandoned the moral compass of their father. They did not walk in his ways.
Which leads directly to the second indictment. They actively profited from their position.
And there is a fascinating linguistic thread here. The specific Hebrew word used to describe their pursuit of lucre, or dishonest gain, is the exact same word used centuries earlier in the book of Exodus.
When Moses was setting up the original judicial system in the wilderness.
Yes. His father-in-law, Jethro, gave him strict advice on who to appoint. Jethro warned that any leader must be someone who hates covetousness.
That exact same Hebrew word.
Exactly. A leader must actively despise the idea of leveraging their authority for personal financial gain.
And Samuel's sons didn't hate that concept. They built their entire careers around it.
They looked at judicial authority and didn't see a calling to serve.
They saw a hustle. They monetized the bench.
They really did. And that naturally bleeds into the third indictment.
Yeah.
They accepted bribes.
And in the ancient Israelite context, this wasn't just a minor ethical breach. It was a direct violation of their core constitutional law.
Right. Deuteronomy 16 strictly forbids taking payments for verdicts.
It provides a psychological explanation, too. It states that bribery literally blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous.
Because when a judge accepts a bribe, their perception of reality is fundamentally altered.
You no longer see justice or truth. You only see the transaction.
Exactly. Which makes the entire society an incredibly dangerous place for the vulnerable.
Which brings the fourth indictment into sharp focus. Because of this intense desire for financial gain through bribery, they made a mockery of justice.
They actively perverted judgments to favor whoever could pay the highest price.
They weaponized the legal system against the very people they were supposed to be protecting.
If you are listening to this, I want you to really put yourself in the sandals of an average citizen living in or around Beersheba during this time.
Imagine you are a farmer. You have a legitimate property dispute with a wealthy landowner who is encroaching on your fields.
Right, so you go to the local court seeking justice.
But, everyone in town knows that the verdict is already for sale.
The wealthy landowner has already paid off Joel and Abijah.
The system is entirely rigged against you. The sons of the great legendary Samuel are running a mafia-style protection racket from the judicial bench.
The deep, boiling frustration and the sheer helplessness of that situation would just be overwhelming.
The outcry from the Southern Territory was so intense that it made its way all the way up to the nation's elders.
Because it was a profoundly legitimate grievance. The citizens were suffering under a rigged system.
It is entirely reasonable for the elders to look at Joel and Abijah, realize that this is the proposed future of the nation's leadership, and conclude that the society is going to collapse.
Wanting different leadership, wanting a system that actually protected them from this kind of local corruption was not their mistake.
Right, so they realize local corruption is destroying them from the inside out, and a national panic sets in.
But panic rarely breeds good policy.
Never. When the elders of Israel gather together and approach Samuel to present their solution, what exactly do they demand? On the surface, it sounds like a straightforward administrative request. They say, now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.
We have to zero in on the second half of that demand. Like all the nations.
That is the fatal phrase of this entire era.
It is. To understand why that phrase is so catastrophic, you have to look at the broader cultural philosophy Israel had adopted at this time.
The historical records of the Judges period summarize the national mood with a very dark recurring refrain.
Right. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
It was an era of total moral relativism and brutal pragmatism.
The elders weren't seeking a divine solution. They were operating under that exact same relativistic policy. They were simply doing what seemed pragmatic and efficient to them.
But by asking for a king like all the nations, they are completely ignoring the foundational purpose of their own existence.
Exactly. If you go back to Exodus 19, the charter of Israel is laid out clearly.
They were intended to be fundamentally different from every other nation on the planet.
They were supposed to be a set-apart priestly kingdom. Their entire geopolitical purpose was to represent God's character to the rest of the world.
They were meant to be the radical exception, not the rule.
So their request to be like all the nations was a total inversion of that national mission.
Instead of being set apart to witness to the surrounding cultures, they just wanted to assimilate.
They wanted to blend in. They looked at the pagan nations around them, nations with standing armies, centralized wealth, massive fortifications, and intimidating monarchs.
And they wanted that exact same visible security. They wanted political normalcy.
Yes.
Think of it like a highly specialized, intensely mission-driven organization. Imagine a group of elite doctors who form a nonprofit dedicated to providing radical, free medical care in war zones.
Okay, great analogy.
They have a totally unique culture, a unique funding model, and their mission is entirely built on sacrifice. But then they hit a rough patch. Maybe a couple of their regional directors get caught embezzling funds.
Like Samuel's sons.
Exactly. Instead of dealing with the regional directors and fixing the localized corruption, the board of directors completely panics. They look at a massive, cutthroat, profit-driven hospital conglomerate across the street and say, you know what? Let's just do what they do.
Right. Let's abandon our free care model.
Change our entire structural identity and just become a standard profit-driven corporation because it looks normal, it feels safer, and everyone else is doing it.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. And the core takeaway here is incredibly relevant for us today.
Which is?
You can rightly identify a very real problem. In this case, systemic judicial corruption. But you can have completely toxic, self-destructive motives for your proposed solution.
The problem of Samuel's sons was real and needed fixing.
But the elders' motive for the fix, wanting to assimilate, abandoning their unique calling, and mimicking the oppressive nations around them, was disastrous.
This brings us to the root diagnosis of the entire crisis. We have to peel back the layers of this political demand to look at the spiritual rot underneath.
Because there is a deep spiritual rot there.
When the elders present this demand for a king to Samuel, his immediate reaction is intense displeasure. He is highly offended.
From his perspective, they are basically saying, you're old, your kids are criminals, and your life's work is a failure. We're tearing down the whole system.
Samuel is deeply hurt, but instead of lashing out at them, he takes his frustration directly to God in prayer.
And it is crucial to understand Samuel's posture here. For Samuel, praying for the people of Israel wasn't just a religious formality.
It was a core, non-negotiable conviction.
Right. Later in his life, he explicitly states that he believes it would be a sin against God for him to ever stop praying for them.
Even when they are personally rejecting him, insulting his family, and tearing down his legacy, his immediate reflex is intercession, not retaliation.
So Samuel prays, and God responds with this incredibly gentle, almost heartbreaking perspective.
God essentially steps in and absorbs the shame of the rejection so Samuel doesn't have to carry it.
He tells Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them."
That statement is the diagnostic X-ray of this entire narrative.
It really is.
Because when you look at the surface of the conflict, you see secondary issues. You see a debate over authority structures, political systems, foreign policy.
The failures of the local judicial branch.
Right. But when God peels back those layers, he reveals the actual disease: political idolatry.
Idolatry is a heavy concept, and God tells Samuel that this isn't a new phenomenon.
This demand for a king is just the latest chapter in a long, repetitive history of unfaithfulness.
It stretches all the way back to the wilderness, to the moment they built the golden calf at Mount Sinai.
There is a very specific linguistic foundation to how God describes this idolatry, isn't there?
There is. He uses two vivid Hebrew concepts to explain what Israel is doing. The first concept is forsaking or abandoning.
Because remember, Israel wasn't just a collection of tribes. They were bound by a formal covenant with God.
And that covenant contains specific, sworn commitments, like the command in Deuteronomy to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength.
Their demand for a human king was a refusal to rely on that covenant. It was an outright abandonment of their sworn commitments.
And what's the second concept God uses?
It revolves around the word serve.
Right. In the original Hebrew context, this word heavily connotes worship, specifically the worship of foreign gods or idols. God says they are forsaking him and serving other gods.
So they forsake the true king, and they choose to serve to literally worship a human political system.
Which is what is so mind-blowing about this passage.
The elders of Israel weren't out in the town square melting down gold to build a statue of a calf. They weren't performing ancient pagan rituals.
On paper, they were simply requesting a constitutional amendment. They were having a civic meeting about regime change.
But the text definitively categorizes trusting a political system over God as a literal act of idolatry.
That is the crux of the issue, and it changes how we understand idolatry entirely.
Idolatry isn't always ancient statues and incense.
In this case, idolatry is pure pragmatism. It is looking at the invisible covenantal care of God, a God who had consistently delivered them through the judges, and saying, that's not tangible enough.
We want a human king we can see. We want a standing army we can count.
We want a political structure we can control and predict. They were placing their ultimate trust in human governance rather than divine providence.
And by demanding that visible, pragmatic security, they were laying the exact foundation that would inevitably lead to literal physical idol worship under the later monarchs.
Exactly. So let's look at the actual mechanics of the kingdom they are asking for, because there is a massive gap between the blueprint they were given and the reality they demanded.
A lot of people might wonder, was it inherently sinful for them to just desire a monarch in general?
It's a fair question.
Because if you read ahead in their history, they eventually get King David, who is famously described as a man after God's own heart. A truly godly king could have unified and advanced the nation in incredible ways.
That distinction is vital. The sinfulness did not lie in the mere concept of having a king. In fact, centuries before this moment in Ramah, God had already anticipated this exact scenario.
Through Moses, he had provided a highly detailed constitutional blueprint for what an Israelite king was supposed to look like.
In Deuteronomy 17, there is a specific charter of kings laid out.
When you look at that charter, it is wildly different from how any other ancient Near Eastern king operated. There are 6 specific rules decreed for an Israelite king.
Let's explore these because they show exactly what God valued.
The first rule is that the king must be an Israelite. He has to be a member of the covenant community, subject to the same laws and history as the people he leads.
The second rule is that the king must not amass horses.
To a modern ear, that sounds like a strange agricultural restriction.
Right, but in the ancient world, horses, specifically cavalry and war chariots, were the ultimate military technology.
They were the ancient equivalent of tanks.
Exactly. Amassing horses was a direct temptation toward the idolatry of military power. A king with an overwhelming chariot force would naturally begin to trust his own army for security, rather than trusting God to defend the nation.
The third rule is deeply tied to their national trauma. The king must not form an economic or military alliance with Egypt.
Because Egypt was the site of their centuries-long enslavement.
God had miraculously brought them out in the Exodus, For a king to ally with Egypt for economic gain or military backing would literally be throwing the entire nation into reverse.
It would be a return to the very system of oppression they had been rescued from.
The fourth rule dictates that the king must not amass wives.
Again, we have to look at the historical context. In ancient diplomacy, marriages were not about romance. They were political treaties.
Amassing wives meant entering into complex alliances with surrounding pagan nations.
And those foreign marriages inevitably led to the importation of foreign gods, altars, and idolatry into the royal court, which would corrupt the entire nation.
The fifth rule limits royal greed. The king must not amass wealth. He shouldn't be hoarding vast amounts of silver and gold.
Because extreme wealth creates independence. A hyper-wealthy king is tempted to rely on his own riches and economic leverage rather than daily dependence on divine providence.
And the sixth and final rule is perhaps the most profound. The king must personally hand copy, read, and obey the Book of Deuteronomy.
Think about the psychological impact of that final command.
Right.
The king, who is arguably the most powerful man in the nation, is required to sit down like a lowly scribe and painstakingly copy the entire law by hand.
It is an exercise in muscle memory and intense focus.
It was designed to ensure deep humility. It was a daily reminder that he was not the ultimate authority. He was not the lawgiver. He was entirely subject to the law, serving under God and for the benefit of the people.
When you synthesize those 6 rules, they all roll up into one single overarching mandate. The Israelite king must not be like the kings of all the other nations.
A standard worldly king relies on overwhelming military might, complex foreign alliances, political marriages, and massive economic hoarding.
God's blueprint was the exact opposite. A godly king was supposed to be humble, limited in military scope, separated from foreign entanglements, and completely dependent on God.
And notice that 3 of these rules specifically guard against the core impulse of corrupt power, which is the impulse to take.
And that is exactly where the elders' demand goes so terribly wrong. They had absolutely no interest in the Deuteronomy 17 model.
They didn't want a humble, scripture-copying servant leader with a limited defense force and no treasury.
They wanted the visible, powerful, intimidating, wealth-hoarding king of the surrounding nations.
They wanted a political strongman they felt could guarantee their security on worldly terms.
They willingly traded a divine blueprint for a worldly system. And Samuel, having spent his life watching human nature, understands the inevitable catastrophic outcome of this demand.
He knows the reality that absolute power corrupts absolutely.
When sinful, flawed men are handed unchecked royal authority, it never ends with the flourishing of the citizens.
Which leads to the most chilling and detailed part of this entire narrative. God tells Samuel to go ahead and grant their request, but he commands Samuel to issue a severe, highly specific warning first.
Samuel is instructed to explain to the people exactly what the justice of the king will look like.
Remember the irony here. The elders are demanding a king because they are fed up with the localized injustice of Samuel's sons taking bribes.
They are demanding a system that will give them better justice.
And Samuel essentially looks at them and says, "You want to know what the justice of a human king looks like? Let me map it out for you."
He delivers this prophetic, devastating warning, and when you look closely at the language Samuel uses, it is incredibly revealing.
There are dominant keywords that structure his entire argument.
The most prominent word is take. Samuel uses the word take over and over to describe the king's primary function.
Another key concept is appoint, describing how the king will rigidly control the resources he has taken.
And the word your is repeated constantly, emphasizing the devastating, deeply personal invasion this will have on the daily lives and the wealth of Israelite families.
The central thesis of Samuel's warning is unavoidable. Ungodly, unchecked human leadership is fundamentally marked by taking, not serving.
He outlines 4 specific areas of royal exploitation, where this new king will systematically strip the nation of its resources and its freedom.
Let's break down these 4 areas of royal exploitation, because looking back at history, Samuel was proven 100% correct on every single count.
The first area he warns about is the military draft. Samuel tells the people, the king is going to take your sons and appoint them for his chariots and to be his horsemen.
He is going to create a standing army, and he is going to populate it with your children.
To understand the trauma of this, we can look at the historical realities of military conscription.
Regardless of where anyone stands on the modern politics of a military draft, history universally shows that conscription causes profound societal friction and trauma.
We saw it clearly in the 20th century, particularly with the drafts surrounding the Vietnam War.
The source text highlights that, historically, those events caused massive societal upheaval, resistance, and deep generational pain.
When the state forces citizens to fight, bleed, and die in conflicts they may not believe in, it creates a deep wound in the culture.
Samuel is warning ancient Israel that this king they want so badly is going to enact this exact kind of trauma. He's going to force your children into his military machine to fight for his foreign policy and his vanity projects.
It is the ultimate taking of bodily autonomy by the state. You no longer own your family's labor, the king does.
And that flows right into the second area of exploitation Samuel warns about: forced labor.
He says the king will take your sons and daughters to plow his ground, reap his harvest, and manufacture his weapons of war.
The king will commandeer your family for agricultural labor, palace upkeep, and the military-industrial complex.
And again, the historical record proves this tragically true. Decades later, Israel was ruled by King Solomon.
Solomon is historically celebrated for his immense wisdom and his incredible wealth, but what is often overlooked is how he achieved that wealth.
The historical texts, like 1 Kings 9, reveal that Solomon was notorious for utilizing massive, crushing systems of forced labor.
To build his temple, his elaborate palaces, and his fortress cities, he essentially enslaved tens of thousands of his own citizens.
He drafted them into forced labor camps. The majestic buildings of the kingdom were built on the backs of exploited Israelites.
The third area of exploitation is property theft. Samuel warns that the state will not just take your labor, it will take your land.
The king will seize your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, specifically the very best of them, and he will give them to his servants and his political cronies.
The state will use its monopoly on violence to redistribute private property to reward its loyalists.
The most notorious historical example of this phenomenon occurs later in the monarchy during the reign of King Ahab.
There is a detailed account of a citizen named Naboth who owned a beautiful vineyard right next to the royal palace.
Ahab wanted the vineyard to use as a vegetable garden. When Naboth rightfully refused to sell his ancestral inheritance, the state simply murdered him.
Ahab's wife, Jezebel, orchestrated a plot to have Naboth falsely accused of treason and stoned to death, simply so the king could legally seize the property.
It is the ultimate horrifying perversion of justice, where the state literally kills its citizens to steal their land.
And finally, the fourth area of exploitation is taxation and the confiscation of wealth.
Samuel warns that the king is going to take 1/10 of your seed, 1/10 of your vineyards, and 1/10 of your flocks.
The king will extract wealth directly from the agricultural output of the Israelite people to fund his bloated administration, his standing army, and his opulent lifestyle.
When you step back and look at the cumulative weight of these four areas, the military draft, tearing families apart, forced labor camps, building royal monuments, the state murdering citizens to steal their vineyards, and heavy taxation depleting the wealth of the working class, you see the staggering, tragic irony of the elders' demand.
They were so intensely fed up with the localized, petty injustice of Samuel's sons taking bribes down in Beersheba that they willingly, voluntarily traded it for a massively demanding, deeply entrenched, and highly corruptible systemic injustice.
It's mind-boggling. They basically held a national assembly and voted to become institutionalized victims.
And history shows that Samuel's warning was actually somewhat conservative compared to what the kings would eventually do.
Later kings, like Manasseh, would unleash reigns of terror, filling the streets of Jerusalem with innocent blood.
Even King David, the supposed gold standard of Israelite kings, would fall prey to these exact traps.
David used his absolute royal power to take another man's wife, Bathsheba.
And when she became pregnant, David used the military apparatus he controlled to have her husband, Uriah, intentionally abandoned on the front lines to be murdered, covering up his own crime.
All of this happened while the average citizens were out fighting David's wars. Even the absolute best human king fell deeply into the exact patterns of taking, exploiting, and killing that Samuel warned about.
This brings us to the ultimate, inevitable consequence of their demand. After outlining all this exploitation, Samuel concludes his chilling warning by describing the final outcome.
He tells the people exactly how the story ends. He says, "And you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself."
Whom you have chosen for yourselves. You demanded this system. You own the consequences.
There's a deeply tragic historical poetry operating here. If you zoom out and look at the broad sweep of their national history, in the book of Exodus, they cried out in agony because of Pharaoh, a brutal foreign oppressor.
In the era of the judges, they cried out because of the surrounding pagan nations oppressing them.
Now, Samuel says, "The day is rapidly approaching when you will cry out in agony because of the oppression of your own domestic rulers."
The call is going to come from inside the house.
And what's even more terrifying is the final clause of Samuel's warning. He suggests that when they finally do cry out from under the weight of this domestic oppression, God will not hear them in that day.
The historical texts note that God's people sometimes stubbornly pursue sinful paths that actually hinder their own prayers.
They were willingly, aggressively building the very cage they would eventually be trapped in, and God was warning them that he would not immediately break them out of it once they locked the door.
Which forces us to ask a very profound theological question. If God is omniscient, if he knew this monarchy was going to be an absolute disaster, if he knew that people would suffer under systemic injustice, forced labor, and the theft of their land, why did he give them exactly what they stubbornly asked for?
Why does God sometimes hand people over to their unrighteous desires?
The intersection of human demand and divine response here is a profound example of God's permissive will. It functions simultaneously as an act of both mercy and judgment.
It is an act of mercy because, despite their blatant rejection of his covenant and their idolatrous demand to be like the pagan nations, God did not abandon them.
He told Samuel to grant the request, proving that he was still actively involved with his people, even in the midst of their rebellion. He didn't wipe them out. He continued to guide their history.
But it was also a severe act of judgment because he allowed them to suffer the natural, inevitable consequences of placing flawed, sinful human beings on a pedestal of absolute power.
Think of it like a highly skilled doctor dealing with a stubbornly non-compliant patient. The patient has a serious heart condition, and the doctor prescribes a strict life-saving diet.
But the patient absolutely refuses.
Yeah.
They demand to keep eating toxic, destructive food because it tastes good in the moment and everyone else is eating it.
Eventually, the doctor has to step back and allow the patient to suffer the severe physical pain of their choices, because that pain is the only thing that will finally break their delusion and make them realize how sick they actually are.
Unlike the era of the judges, where God would quickly raise up a deliverer to overthrow the foreign oppressors, God was going to allow this Israelite monarchy to endure for several centuries.
They were going to have to live, suffer, and learn within the deeply flawed system they demanded.
But there is a much larger redemptive arc at play across this history, and it connects directly to the broader worldview of the text.
When you look at the centuries that followed, when the Israelite monarchy eventually crumbled, when king after king failed to uphold justice, when the nation was fractured by civil war and eventually conquered by Babylon, it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that sinful humanity consistently elevates itself at the expense of others.
It proved that no human political system, no matter how well structured, can offer true salvation or lasting justice.
But God used this entirely broken, historically disastrous kingship to point forward. The failure of the human kings created a profound longing for a true king.
It was setting the stage entirely by contrast. When you spend centuries suffering under the greed, the taking, and the violence of human rulers, your heart desperately longs for a king who will actually heal and serve.
Precisely. And in the Christian tradition, that points directly to Jesus.
Mhm.
The contrast is incredibly striking.
Centuries later, when Jesus' own inner circle of disciples were arguing over political power, maneuvering for the highest seats in his future administration, Jesus explicitly shut them down.
In the Gospel of Matthew, he gathers them and says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them," meaning the worldly leaders take, they oppress, they use their power to serve themselves, exactly as Samuel warned.
But then Jesus says, "It shall not be so among you." He introduces a kingdom that is fundamentally, radically different.
It is a kingdom defined by service, not by taking. It is a kingdom where the king lays down his own life for the citizens, rather than drafting the citizens to die for him.
It is to that true king that ultimate submission belongs, because only in him do we find actual mercy and justice rather than exploitation.
That is such a powerful, massive paradigm shift.
We have covered an immense amount of historical and psychological ground today. We started in the dusty southern town of Beersheba, watching Samuel's corrupt sons run a judicial protection racket.
We watched the panicked elders of Israel accurately identify that localized problem, but then propose a catastrophic, systemic solution fueled by a toxic desire to assimilate and be like all the nations.
We peeled back the layers of that demand to see the deep-seated political idolatry, the tragic human instinct to trust a visible political machine over an invisible covenant-keeping God.
We examine the terrifying historical realities of the military drafts, the forced labor camps, and the heavy taxation that inevitably come when humans are handed absolute power.
And finally, we saw how God, in his permissive will, allowed this deeply flawed system to run its course, to ultimately prove the absolute necessity of a true servant-hearted king.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to really mull over. It is incredibly easy for us to look back 3,000 years at the elders of Israel and judge their foolishness.
We can clearly see the disaster they were walking into.
But the application of this history cuts right into our own internal governance today. I want you to look closely at your own life right now.
Where are you currently experiencing deep frustration, anxiety, or suffering?
And instead of taking that frustration to God, trusting his unseen timing and his character, where are you demanding a pragmatic, immediate, worldly solution simply so you can feel secure and like everyone else?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? Are we repeating the exact same pattern?
Are you seeking to surrender your desires and your anxieties to the true king who operates on a foundation of service and redemption? Or are you secretly asking for a worldly system, a tangible mechanism, or a human leader that you think you can control to guarantee your safety, even if, deep down, you know that placing your ultimate trust in that system will ultimately deplete and enslave you?
Wow. Are you actively building your own cage? That is a thought that is going to linger with me all week. Because sometimes when you finally get the exact system you demanded, you realize the x-ray machine wasn't broken at all. It was just showing a profound disease you didn't want to admit you had. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to question your own motives and what you place your trust in this week. We'll catch you next time.